Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington Perry with the Circle of Atonement, and I'm here with Circle founder Robert Perry. And today we are talking about how do you forgive yourself? This conversation is inspired in part by a course that Mindvalley offered on forgiveness. Many of you may be familiar with Mindvalley. They're a big online learning company. And before running their course on forgiveness, their founder, Vishen, surveyed the thousands of people who had registered for their program and said, what is the main question that you have about forgiveness? And the overwhelming response was, I want to know how to forgive myself. And this was really interesting to Robert and me because Vishen's survey echoed what we hear at the Circle all the time. Forgiveness is the course's central teaching, and so we talk about it here quite a bit. And inevitably, when the subject of forgiveness comes up, this idea always comes along with it. How do I forgive myself? And the course has some very specific things to say about how we forgive ourselves, but no surprise, the course's views tend to be different than what we think. So, Robert, before we get into the specific track of how to forgive ourselves, I just want to back up a bit and talk about the course's views on forgiveness in general. So, I know it's such a big topic, but if you could explain the course's views on forgiveness in a nutshell, what would you say?
Yeah, ultimately, it's very simple. I think students get very confused because they know that the course's view of forgiveness is not the conventional view, but then they don't know what that unconventional view is. And ultimately, it is simple. The idea is that we forgive by changing our perception, by changing our interpretation. So we realize that our perception of the other person in which we're angry is a wrong perception. Even if we get a lot of the details right, it's wrong in terms of our fundamental view of what's real. If we can see them as they really are, our anger will automatically vanish. We will see that they are divine beings, as the Course says, sons of God, guiltless sons of God, who have just made a mistake within a dream. They didn't gain at our expense when they attacked us. Instead, they lost. And so their attack was a call for help. And it doesn't deserve punishment. So the basic idea is if we can change our perception to see what's real, especially to see the other person as they really are, our anger automatically goes. And that's forgiveness.
It is interesting that the course has so much to say about forgiveness. It is the course's central teaching, and yet you can actually boil it down into some fairly simple description of how we forgive. It goes back to, as we also like to say, the introduction in the course: nothing real can be threatened, nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. And so what we're doing, as you're saying, is just looking through the bodies, the personalities, even the character of other people to that invisible divine reality of who they really are. And that's the basis on which we forgive.
Yeah, that's true. It
Yeah.
ultimately is quite simple.
So I keep saying that forgiveness is the course's central teaching, but I feel like we should talk about why that is. So, what is the evidence that we have for this claim that forgiveness is the course's central teaching?
Well, that is something that's accepted by most course students and course teachers. And it's one of those things that there's good reason for everyone holding that view. The course does say, like, for instance, I think lesson 169, it says forgiveness is salvation's central theme. There are other places where the course summarizes itself and puts forgiveness at the heart of that summary. But I think the best evidence for it is just as you read through the whole course, all these themes weave in, weave out. We'll see them for a while and won't see much of them for a long time. And forgiveness is just a staple, that the Course returns to again and again and again. Many text sections are devoted to it. Many workbook lessons are devoted to it. There are just lengthy, repeated discussions, and it kind of is always present. So if you just step back and look at the emphasis placed upon it, I think that says this is what the Course is really centrally about.
We talk so much about the Course's emphasis on forgiving other people. And as I was saying in the intro, inevitably, when you say the Course's central teaching is forgiveness, we're talking here about forgiving other people, a hand will raise and someone will say, well, don't we have to forgive ourselves first? So let's talk about that idea. Do we have to forgive ourselves first in order to forgive someone else?
Well, in the Course, the answer is a resounding no. The Course's main focus is on forgiving other people. And I think in Course in Miracles circles, we've kind of, I don't know, we've gotten so metaphysical, we've watered down the notion of other people, right? They're like our mirrors, or they aren't even there, or,
There's no one out
and
there to forgive.
nobody out there to forgive. And if you look at the discussions of forgiveness again and again and again, they are about giving forgiveness to other people. So you don't have to forgive yourself first. And in fact, we'll see that the order in which we forgive is the other way around, but we'll get there.
Yeah. I forget how you phrased it when we were planning for this podcast. What did you say? We metaphysicalized ourselves back to the crib or something like that. Yeah, I mean, we were talking about this idea in the context of what you and I often call the cult of self, which is this idea that your self comes first, that your self-love, your self-care, protecting yourself, drawing boundaries, these ideas have become spiritualized. This is what we hear as contemporary spiritual language. Take care of yourself. But it does feel like that's what's drawing us backwards, because the emphasis on the self is drawing us away from each other and just creating more separation versus healing it. And if it's truly spiritual, I genuinely believe that if something is true spiritual teaching, at its core, it's a healing, not a division.
Yeah.
So it's really sad that so much of spiritual language has been co-opted by this focus on the self.
It's true.
Up to and including forgiveness, obviously,
Totally. Yeah. I think that because we are awash in messages that you and I would say basically are cult of self messages, you hear them in spirituality, you hear them in, kind of pop psychology and self-help. You and I are fond of talking about how you see them on mugs and t-shirts in gift shops. Everywhere you look, you see messages that basically talk about affirming, extolling, celebrating, taking care of, protecting yourself. And when you're surrounded by those messages, it distorts your mind, right? So suddenly you start thinking that that's where spiritual wisdom should go. And when you hear things about, put your own oxygen mask on first, or when you hear things about, are you taking care of yourself? Something in your mind goes, that feels right. That sounds like cutting edge wisdom. When in fact, we've just been programmed by marinating in it for so long.
And it also just feeds into what we want to do anyway. And so forgiving other people is really hard work, as we say here all the time. It's easy to sit back and say, well, the real work here is just forgiving myself. And you can spend a lot of time doing that. If you think that you have to forgive yourself in order to forgive someone else, you can spend decades in this cycle of saying, well, I just really need to focus on forgiving myself before I go out and forgive someone else. And it's just a safe way to hide, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I was looking around online at quotes about forgiving yourself. And what was really interesting about those quotes is that you find a website with 40 quotes on forgiving yourself or 30 quotes. And a lot of those quotes on forgiving yourself would really just be good old fashioned quotes about forgiving others. But what I noticed was that once you get past a certain point, like I'm going to say like 1970, what, if we're talking about older voices like Martin Luther King Jr. or Albert Schweitzer or whatever, they were mostly talking about forgiving other people. But once you get past, and I'll say 1970 and more contemporary, then the voices extolling forgiving yourself come in. I feel like there's been this cultural shift as the cult of self has moved in and grabbed center stage.
That is so interesting, isn't it? That you can actually see it happening. We keep talking about the cult of self and its effect on everything, our politics, our business, academia, etc., and how its grubby little hands have gotten into spirituality and pulled us backwards as well. And so in this, I know you don't want to call it research because it wasn't very in depth, but it was just,
Right.
it's so interesting that when you were looking at this idea of how do we forgive, there's a period of focus on other people. And then you can almost see the shift go to, oh, it's just about forgiving yourself and what other people. And that's where we're stuck right now. And you see it all around.
Yeah. I
But
think I
go
think there
ahead.
was a time, you say there was a time when the focus was on forgiving others. I think that time is known as all of human history, basically. And it's just we were in this recent weird phase where we think we like get something that previous generations didn't get, and it's all about me.
Right. Well, that's a good point. But I don't even buy the idea that we can't forgive ourselves and that's the big issue here. Because as a thought experiment, think about when you go out to dinner with your friends or when you're talking to a family member or whatever, any human interaction. When people are complaining or when they're griping about something, it's not about 9 times out of 10, it's not going to be about something they did. So they're not struggling with forgiving themselves. This is not our dinner table conversation. We're always bitching about other people. And it's really interesting that when you get into a room, a spiritual teaching space, and you say, we're talking about forgiveness, and everyone says, oh, yes, I know, I just can't forgive myself, and it's a real problem. And then you take them out to dinner that night, and they're complaining about everybody in their life. So it's not actually like the real issue here is not about forgiving ourselves. Like, and somewhere we know it, don't you think?
Well, I think it's a bit more complicated than that. And the more I've thought about this, the more I see our issues with forgiving ourselves as taking place on two levels. On the superficial level, I think we let ourselves off the hook very easily. We have excuses, right? We talk about, we were doing our best. And we're like, yep, I can forgive myself for that. And it just seems so easy and so convenient. But I think on a deeper level, there is a guilt on that deeper level that I think we aren't aware of most of the time. And on that level, I think we find like the real level of our guilt, we find it very hard to forgive ourselves, like practically impossible. And so on these websites, I would see all of them acknowledge like it's hardest to forgive yourself. And I think there's truth in that if we're talking about that deeper level. And that brings up for me a story where I was really brought face to face with the two different levels. So 20 years ago, my dad died. And for years up until his death, I noticed that he put more effort into the relationship than I did. And I had a pretty like breezy, cavalier attitude about that. Like I was living my life about ideals that were very different than his. And,
Like
you know,
love,
what's that? Like
like
love.
love.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, let me tell my story.
Sorry.
um, the peanut gallery can pipe down. So yeah, so and I thought, here we're so different. I mean, I'm adopted, so I don't have that same genetic heritage with my family. And I just thought, yeah, it's fine that I'm focused on what I'm doing. Um, and that he puts more effort into the relationship. I forgave myself very easily for that. Or so I thought. Because when he died, immediately I felt a guilt that was too like deep and dark for words. And I just felt like there was nothing I could do in the face of it. I was in its grip. And he had never put guilt on me about nothing, not a shred about anything in the relationship. And yet I felt like so unforgivable. And there's those two levels. I'm going along, forgiving myself just fine. It's not even an effort. But deep down, a whole other thing is going on.
Hmm. I know you have another story along that line too.
Yeah. I mean, I have a story about doing our best
Hmm.
because that's what we tell ourselves. Like, I was just doing my best. I was trying in the midst of lots of stress and difficulties and obstacles. And come on, like, get off my case. Um, so one of my children, raised four, uh, has a habit of being kind of perpetually not ready on time. Um, and so I recently had an experience where it was like, can you, like, I know you have this thing. Can you, I mean, this goes back years. I'd be like the last parent at school waiting for her to come out, like, day after day,
Yeah.
week
And to
after
be
week.
fair, you're not talking about 4 minutes. You're talking about like 40 minutes
Yeah, it gets
waiting at a
pretty
stretch.
long.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, I know you have this thing, but can I rely on you this time? And she was like, yeah, absolutely. Um, and so sure enough, she was like, half hour late or something. And so I was like, okay, I was relying upon you. Basically I don't want to blame you, but can you give me some hope for something changing? And she was like, yeah, I mean, in the future, I'll do my best. And then she's added, just like I've been doing.
Right. And I know you were like a little reluctant to tell that story because you don't want to seem like you're talking about your kids, which is, I mean, I do that all the time. I have no hesitation outing my children as
Yeah.
being typical teenagers. And I think that's like a typical teenager
Yeah, it is.
thing to
And they're great
do.
kids. They're absolutely great kids.
Yeah, they're great kids. They really are. But this idea of, well, I'm just doing my best, it is so reflective of the way that we use that language everywhere. It's not just in our house, it's going on everywhere. We say, well, I'm just doing my best, or you are meant to forgive someone else because they're just doing their best. But really, we're not. And I know that I sound really cynical already in this podcast, like I don't really believe that it's about forgiving ourselves. I think we have a problem forgiving other people. And no, we're actually not doing our best. But
Everyone's forgiving themselves for their judgments of you right now.
if you well, yeah, get in line. But but that idea of doing our best, I also think that is something we say, just like your daughter did, to get ourselves off the hook. Like if you just say, well, I'm doing my best, or they're doing their best, it's just a way of staying stuck in that superficial place, isn't it? Because where you're not really looking. You probably told yourself that you were doing your best with your dad when he was alive. And it was only when he died that you realized, oh my God, I actually wasn't doing my best. And now it's too late.
Mm-hmm. Well, my response to the doing your best thing, which everyone loves, right? I remember giving a long talk on forgiveness somewhere, and the lady said, "That sounds all lovely, but I just take care of that so much more simply. I just say everyone's doing their best." Um, and my response is that I don't think that is at all compatible with free will. Okay, free will means you're free to choose, and that means you can choose your best, you can choose your worst, you can choose everything in between. You are free. So if you have that freedom to choose along that entire spectrum, running all the way from your very best to your very worst, how is it possible that you will always, without fail, choose nothing but the very top of the range? It's not possible. You'd have to be a robot to always do your best. And from my standpoint and the course's standpoint, we have free will. And so
Mhm.
we're doing our best, I think, rarely. We're doing something in between our best and worst most of the time. And we've got to find a different basis for forgiving ourselves and forgiving each other than we're always doing our best. Because I think it's not true. And I think it's some weird article of faith. Like, how do all these people know that everyone's doing, like, where is the proof that we're all doing our best? It's just this feel good article of faith we throw out there.
Right. And what I love about the story with your daughter is that the little like kicker at the end where she's like, I'm doing my best, like I always do. Meanwhile, somewhere she knows that she's actually not doing her best. And again, it's just typical teenage behavior. And it's also typical for all of us. But I want to kind of hone in on this idea that we're doing our best, but everyone else isn't. And I think this is one thing that really trips us up as well. So we think that we're just trying our best, but everyone else is making these horrible, traumatic mistakes
Mm-hmm.
and sins, really. So we're just making simple mistakes and they're actually sinning. And that tends to be how we view things. And the course echoes this idea. I love this quote. It says, yours are mistakes, but his are sins and not the same as yours. His marriage merit punishment, while yours, in fairness, should be overlooked. So this
What a
idea,
great passage.
I know, isn't that just brilliant? So because it speaks to what's going on in our mind all the time. You know, we're just doing our best, but everyone else's mistakes need to be viewed as sinful. They need to be made guilty. Their mistakes need to be brought up continually, always processed. I always like to say, fashioned into a mallet to hit them over the head so that they comply. You know, you never forget someone else's mistakes, but yours, you know, whatever, you know,
In
you were doing your
fairness,
best. Yeah, in fairness, they should be overlooked. And it's a huge double standard, but it's also very common.
yeah, and that really speaks to, I think, that more superficial level of self-forgiveness I was talking about, where on that surface level, we forgive ourselves in a way that is very much based on a double standard, right? It's like, well, my mistakes, obviously, in fairness, they should be overlooked. They were no big deal. They were innocent mistakes. Whereas yours, so we let ourselves off the hook in a way we're not letting others off the hook. There's a double standard there. And I think that that exposes a kind of an ego that is present in a lot of our normal forgiveness of self.
Yeah. Well, I know I love this story, but a few years ago, I think it's like 2017, I told you that we were talking about this idea of just staying on the surface and not looking very deep at our own lives. And I mentioned this in relation to guilt. I was like, I don't really have a connection to guilt. I don't feel very guilty. And you were like, well, that's just a failure of introspection. And I think that's what's going on here. I think that we can just say we're trying our best. We don't, um, you know, we're just making mistakes. And that's a way of not going to that deeper level because we're afraid of the guilt that comes along with that looking. And I think that we're very, very in touch with this idea when it comes to other people. We're very quick to accuse other people of not looking at what they've done wrong. And I think on some level, we know that part of the reason why they're not looking is because they don't want to feel the guilt that comes along with making mistakes. But that's another thing that we don't apply to ourselves. I think we have a collective failure of introspection on that level. Like, we don't go deep enough to get in touch with the guilt that we feel that's there from the course perspective. We're driven by guilt from a course perspective, whether we take a look at it or not.
Yeah. I'm really glad you said all that. I think it's so true. I think on the surface, we think, yeah, I've forgiven myself. I'm fine, and down
I don't
deep,
have much of a connection with guilt.
I don't have much of a connection with guilt. And down deep, we feel horribly guilty. And some people are more aware of that than others.
Well, so this podcast is about how do we forgive ourselves. And if this is such a big problem in our world and in our minds, let's just get really clear on what it is that we're forgiving ourselves for. I mean, there might be some listeners who are in a space of like not only not connecting to their own guilt, but not even connecting to the idea of why they should forgive themselves. So let's talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting to watch different people on that level, because some people are really sensitive to the guilt in them and really aware of it. And some people are more like, what are we talking about? But I think it just runs the gamut. It goes all the way from sins of commission, as they used to say, to sins of omission, things you should have done, should have said, places where you were neglectful. And then it also has to do not just with the outer behaviors, but also with the inner stance, thoughts you've had, feelings you've had, a lack of love in yourself, judgment in yourself. And then I think if we can go just a little bit deeper, there's just a sense of, and my favorite description of this sense of something is just like at the core of me, there's something that is just selfish and callous and willing to be destructive and willing to run people over and keep driving. My favorite description of that is from this mystical text from medieval England called The Cloud of Unknowing. And there he talked about the foul, stinking lump, basically, of self. So you come face to face with this foul, stinking lump inside of you. And that, I think, is like the core of it, like feeling like I am just this foul, stinking lump.
Reminds me of the quote, made a devil of God's son. Like, I think if we go too deep, we were afraid of that we may have done that to ourselves, that we may be so corrupt that we've made a devil of God's son. And so the deeper we go, the more that idea comes to the surface, and we're afraid of it. So we stay away from it. And so we don't get in touch with why we need to forgive ourselves. But don't you think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
The Course talks about how we believe that if we really saw ourselves as we are, we would rush to death by our own hand.
So that's going on in the background of all of our lives, right? It's the software, from a Course perspective, it's the software that is always humming in the background, like this sense of guilt, whether we're in touch with it or not. But it's there, and it's driving us. Yeah. Okay.
And that's why we have fear. The Course says fear comes from the guilt.
So let's talk about what the Course says about forgiving ourselves. So forgiving ourselves is a goal in the Course. The Course has many goals, but it does list forgiving ourselves as one of them in ways that feel pretty significant. You have a couple of quotes to share on that.
Yeah, so just a few quotes here. One says, your sole responsibility must be to take forgiveness for yourself. Another one says, as you condemn only yourself, so do you forgive only yourself. And finally, to the Holy Spirit, The world is a place where you learn to forgive yourself what you think of as your sins. And that all kind of makes sense if you realize that one way to talk about this journey is we're journeying to the remembrance or the awakening to who we really are. And who we are is the guiltless Son of God. So how can you remember that you are the guiltless Son of God as long as you feel you're guilty, as long as you haven't forgiven yourself? So it makes sense that this is a hugely important goal in the Course. We should also say that from the Course's standpoint, and I think Course students know this, forgiveness of ourselves is always justified. I mean, if we are the guiltless Son of God, then we're obviously justified in forgiving ourselves. The Course even says that it's not that God always forgives us, it's that he doesn't even know why he would have to forgive us. He doesn't hold anything against us. And if God is God, if he is the omniscient one, if he knows what's real, and he looks at us and sees nothing to forgive, then we're justified in letting go of all the things that, we feel guilty for, we feel sinful over.
That's a really hard perspective to hold on to. The idea that we can let absolutely anything go, regardless of whether it was done by someone else or done by ourselves. And that if we could forgive as God forgives, as you're saying, the Course says God doesn't need to forgive because he never condemned. Well, that seems to be like all that we do is look around and find things to condemn. And such is our world. That's why we have the world that we do.
Yeah.
But I just want to kind of back up to the quotes that you were reading. You mentioned your sole responsibility must be to take forgiveness for yourself. As you condemn only yourself, so do you forgive only yourself. Now, these are quotes that students have brought up to say, well, okay, it must be that my responsibility here is just to forgive myself versus forgiving other people. So these quotes in some way seem to be reinforcing the very idea that we've been critiquing. So if the sole responsibility is to forgive yourself, then isn't the Course also omitting other people?
Well, that's a very good question. And that brings us to our big punchline for this episode, which is that the big focus in the Course is on forgiving others, and that forgiving them is how we reach the goal of forgiving ourselves. We forgive them first, and that becomes the road to forgiving ourselves. So in a nutshell, that's how we forgive ourselves. And so, we need to kind of unpack this here, but that's our big focus. That's our big theme. This theme is very clear in the Course. I mean, we don't have time in a 1 hour podcast to go into a lot of evidence for it, but it's not like it's that subtle. There are a couple of places, especially in the workbook, that say this is like the formula. And I want to read this one place because it's my favorite spot. This is in lesson 297. And that lesson is forgiveness is the only gift I give. Now notice it's something you give, meaning to others. And let me read the first paragraph of that lesson. It says, forgiveness is the only gift I give to others because it is the only gift I want for myself. And everything I give to them, I give myself. And I'll say more about that. Really important sentence. But then he goes on to say, this is salvation's simple formula. This is the formula. And I, who would be saved, who would find salvation, would make it mine to be the way I live within a world that needs salvation and that will be saved as I accept atonement for myself. So first, I want to talk more about that first sentence, which to me has taken on such importance. I use it as a kind of a practice, takeoff point. The idea is you're saying, well, the only gift I give to everyone is I forgive them. Why is that? Because that's the only gift I really want from them. And by giving it to them, I actually give it to myself. Like the forgiveness I want to receive from them, I don't have to wait for them to give me. If I give that gift of forgiveness to them, I give it to myself and I will receive it. And then he says that's salvation's simple formula. I want to make that my formula. And I want to make that the way I live, my way of life. So my formula and my way of life. And that just, to me, when we read those lines, we are looking at the absolute core of A Course in Miracles. It's all about I give forgiveness to them because that's how I'm going to receive forgiveness for myself.
Doesn't that idea only make sense when you're in touch with the sense of guilt that we've been talking about? I mean, I know that one of the criticisms of the Course is that it makes us look at the ways in which we feel guilty, the ways in which we think that we've made a devil of God's son. But at the same time, if you applied this, forgiveness is the only gift I give because it's the only gift I want, you have to know that you want forgiveness because you're feeling that sense of guilt. You're feeling that sense of corruption yourself. And so it's the other person's forgiveness that relieves you of that. And so knowing that, you offer forgiveness so that it can come back to you and relieve you of your own sense of guilt. And if you're not in touch with that, then you're going to think that forgiveness is just you on your pedestal looking down on everyone else and forgiving them as an act of charity. And that is how we tend to view forgiveness. Forgive not because they deserve it, forgive because you deserve peace. So you're not forgiving because the other person inherently deserves it in any way. You're just forgiving to make yourself feel better. And so unless you're in touch with that idea that you need forgiveness too, this idea might bounce off from lesson 297.
Yeah, I want to say a couple of things about that. One is that I think the forgiveness, once we forgive, it comes back to us both just psychologically, even if they don't return it, but it also comes back from them often returning it. So it's great when they return it, that helps us. And when they don't, we still have a sense of receiving it. But I want to expand upon that thing you just said, because it's very interesting. I use the three parts of that first sentence as a practice focus a lot. So what I'll do is I'll say, forgiveness is the only gift I give to so-and-so, and have a sense of giving it to them. And then I say, because it is the only gift I want from so-and-so, and I can't tell you how many times I say that line and I go, oh, well, that's true. I'm not very aware of that normally, but it's true. I've made so many mistakes in that relationship. I so want their absolution, but I'm not generally cognizant of that. So I think you're right that we want it. We feel guilty. We feel like we screwed up. We've fallen short. And being aware of that can drive the forgiveness process. We can think, oh, I'll forgive them because that's how that guilt in me is ultimately going to be relieved.
So this idea of forgive and you'll be forgiven, as you give forgiveness, you receive forgiveness. This is the Course's plan for how we get home. This is everywhere in the Course, cover to cover, all 3 volumes. So if we understand this as the idea, how do we practically apply it?
Yeah, well, it does show up in the practice in really big ways. There's a lot of forgiveness exercises, not just in the workbook, but also in the text. However, I think the ones in the workbook are particularly important because the workbook has a series of lessons scattered over the first 200 lessons where we choose people to forgive and then forgive them. And in those lessons, you totally see this pattern. And the place perhaps where it's the most clear uh, and obvious is in lesson 46, and that is God is the love in which I forgive. And there's these two phases of the practice period in that lesson. In one phase, you choose people to forgive, and then with each one, you say, God is the love in which I forgive you, and you name that person. And then he says, the purpose of the first phase, this is a quote, of today's practice is to put you in a better position to forgive yourself. So then the second phase, after you've forgiven all those people, the second phase is you say, God is the love in which I forgive myself. And you spend several minutes adding on thoughts that are related to God is the love in which I forgive myself, because that's the big punchline. So the idea is you forgive all these people to get you in a position to do the last part, which is forgive yourself.
It's really interesting because as you and I like to discuss, there's so many lessons in the course where you're applying what you're learning to other people. You're applying the practice to other people. But there's no lesson in the workbook that asks us to forgive ourselves. So we are being asked to list the grievances, the qualities of other people that we want to forgive, but the course doesn't ever turn that on us and say, think about the things in yourself that you need to forgive and then go through a process of letting that go. And that's really interesting because there's so much in the course about other people and nothing directly about us on that
Yeah,
level.
the course is so good at fleshing out its theory in the form of practice. The practices really reflect the theory. So if we're supposed to forgive ourselves first, that's the big focus. Where are those practices? You're right, they just aren't there. In the course, in the workbook, especially, the way you get to self-forgiveness is you forgive other people first.
I want to go back to this idea of getting in touch with our guilt and wanting forgiveness from other people and how much we need that, even though we're not really in touch with it. So the course talks about how we can't actually give ourselves innocence. God gave us our original innocence. But the course is also always talking about our brother as our savior. So talking about another person as our savior. And so let's talk about that idea. What does that mean? And how does it apply to this idea of forgiving ourselves?
Yeah, well, that's a whole topic. I think we had a podcast episode that I'm not sure is available anymore on our brother as our savior. Really rich topic. And the idea is that our brother is our savior because if we see him as he is, we will see a holy being blessing us and purifying and healing us. And if we see our brother as he is, many of our brothers will actually and sisters will save us more actively. They will return our gift of forgiveness to us. But the course in several key places says that they can do for us what we can't do for ourselves. One place says you cannot wake yourself. Basically, you have to forgive your brother, then he'll wake you up. There's another place that says you cannot give yourself your innocence, for you are too confused about yourself. I think we're too prone to give ourselves a pseudo innocence, like we've been talking about. But should one brother dawn upon your sight as wholly worthy of forgiveness, then your concept of yourself is wholly changed. So if we want to change our concept of ourselves to one that's innocent, to one that's forgiven, the way to do that is we give forgiveness to a brother. And that person saves us either through their actions or just through us seeing something in that person that we had not seen.
Yeah, this reminds me of the primary definition of miracles as we describe it here at the Circle. There's a real temptation to just cut it off as a miracle is defined as an expression of love. And I can see why people would want to do that because it's just easy to say a miracle is an expression of love. But It's really helpful, and it's certainly in line with this idea to go all the way with that definition, that a miracle is defined as an expression of love that has a healing effect on the other person that in turn heals you. And I think forgiveness is the highest form of love. And so if you just replace the word love with forgiveness, then this is the idea that comes through. So it's an expression of forgiveness that heals the other person, that in turn heals you.
Yeah.
And that is going to happen on some level, as you were saying just a minute ago, whether or not the other person returns your forgiveness or not, on some spiritual level, on the level of the Holy Spirit that's shared between you both, that forgiveness is accepted and received and given back. And so from an understanding of that, we can know that no expression of love is wasted, no expression of forgiveness is wasted. It's always going to come back and heal you on some level.
Yeah.
And so it's just such a reinforcement of that idea that in order to receive it, you give it first. And you can see in these teachings how the Course is always advancing that idea.
Yeah. Because we're getting close on time, I think we should really dive into like, what's the connection between forgiving them and forgiving ourselves? Because we don't seem to see that connection, right? We're not thinking, I'll forgive them because that'll put me in a better position to forgive myself. When we think about the value of forgiving others, we're generally thinking like, well, my anger and resentment are like a poison inside me. They're eating me alive, and they're causing health problems, and they're chaining me to this past victimization. So I'll forgive to free myself of all that. And there's that line that everybody loves, forgive not because they deserve it, but because you deserve peace. So it's like we're looking for peace, like relief from the anger and sense of being victimized. We're not looking for self-forgiveness from forgiving them. I found a list online of 3 benefits of forgiveness, forgiving others. And here's what they are. Number 1 is you release toxicity stored in your body. Number 2 is you change your perception of yourself away from victim consciousness. Number 3 is you step into your personal power and responsibility.
I could see why these reasons to forgive are effective.
They
Because
are,
these
but
feel good. Forgiving the other person doesn't have the same appeal.
But why don't we say, and I think the awareness just isn't out there. I think we've got a lack of understanding of how our minds work. We need to switch that to the benefits of forgiving others is I come to forgive myself. It's not the only benefit, but let's feature that benefit.
You could say, I'm forgiving someone else so that I can forgive myself. And if you want to throw in these benefits, then I think the Course would agree that it would release toxicity stored in your illusory body. So we forgive in order to release ourselves from guilt. And then we have all these attendant benefits as well.
Yeah.
So we're coming to the end here. Was there anything else that you wanted to say on the logic behind the Course's approach to forgiveness?
Well, we've got to go dive into that. Because what is the logic? Like, why?
Well, let's talk about that. I feel like you've been talking about that idea, but let's get super crystal clear on what is the logic, what is the connection between forgiving others and forgiving ourselves?
Yeah, why does one lead to the other? I mean, I don't think anybody sees that connection, and so we need to make that really clear and make it sound logical and plausible. My understanding. And appealing, because honestly, I know I feel like this idea of we want to forgive because we deserve peace, not because they deserve forgiveness, is so appealing to us on some level. Yeah.
And this idea of forgiving other people because we see the invisible divine reality in them, and therefore we can let their behaviors go, is not appealing to people.
But forgiving them so we can forgive ourselves, surely that's appealing. Surely.
Only if we're in touch with our desire for forgiveness ourselves.
That's true. That's true. We have to be in touch. But people, why does everybody want to know how to forgive themselves unless they feel the need to? Anyway.
That was my point earlier. I think we just say it, but we don't really believe it. Because when you're out with talking to other people, they're not talking about the need to forgive themselves. It's only in the spiritual context that we talk about the need to forgive ourselves. In everyday environments, not a thing. It's all about what the other person did. But go ahead.
So let's talk about the logic here. My understanding, and it took me so long to see this in the course, even though once you see it, you start noticing it all over the place, like so many things. But the logic, I think, is that there is this deep level sense of consistency and fairness in our minds. And at that deep level, our minds say that whatever they deserve must be what I deserve. So, superficially, we think, well, mine are just mistakes that should be overlooked, whereas theirs are sins. Superficially, we can maintain these double standards, right? My mistakes were totally innocent, not worth talking about. Don't change the subject. The subject is what you did, right? But I think at this deep level of our minds, it's not that way. At that deep level, we can't do double standards. And so what that means is once I decide what you deserve, I have decided in that act, I have decided what I deserve. If I hold you to harsh standards, in the act of holding you to them, I'm holding myself to them. If I say you broke the rules and deserve punishment, in that very act, I'm saying the same thing about me. I will hold myself to that standard. And so what's going on at that level of the mind is a recognition that we all have the same basic rights. And that therefore, in deciding what your rights are, I have decided what my rights are. There's a lot of quotes I could read, but let me read one from the text here. It says, unless you think that all your brothers have an equal right to miracles with you, you will not claim your right to them. You will not claim your right to them because you were unjust to one with equal rights. So you have to kind of think about that quote a little bit. There are a lot of quotes like that, but the basic idea is that as soon as we decide that you have no right to forgiveness, my mind goes, well, we all have the same rights, so that has to mean I have no right to forgiveness. So what an odd thing, because on the surface, we are all about double standards, right? We're all about letting ourselves off the hook and keeping them on the hook. But that's the superficial level. On the level of our guilt, we will be the last person we forgive. And so we will need to forgive all kinds of other people before we decide, okay, I guess if I deserve what they deserve, then I must be as worthy of it as they are.
Yeah, I get it. On some level, we know we can't hold up this double standard. And we know on some level that if they're the sinners we think they are, then so are we. And
right.
I know you love lesson 134, let me perceive forgiveness as it is. And I just recommend anyone who's listening or watching this to read that lesson if you want just a real overview of what the Course has to say about forgiveness. We could do a whole podcast on lesson 134 itself.
It's a really great lesson. Yeah.
But in it, there's this idea of you go through your list of grievances about someone else, and then you ask yourself, would I condemn myself for doing this? So in other words, do I want to condemn myself for doing this? Because if I condemn this other person, then I will condemn myself. And so there's that idea right there. If they're a sinner, so am I. And so again, on some level of our mind, we know that, we know this is a double standard. They can't be completely guilty and we're completely innocent. And yet it's again, I would say, a collective failure of introspection that we don't really fully take in this idea.
Yeah. And I think I think for those who probably feel like this is a long path to forgiving yourself, if you got to forgive all these other people, maybe not everyone, but a lot of people first before you'll really forgive yourself, that just seems like too long. But what if it's the quickest way? So I think what happens is we look at when we get in touch with that well of guilt in ourselves, that deep well, it feels like, oh, it's so hard. I'm the last person I will forgive. And so we try and we try and we try, and it doesn't take, and it doesn't take, and it doesn't take. Maybe the quick way is to learn how to do the somewhat easier job of forgiving them. And then we'll come back to that well and say, well, if 100 of those people out there were worthy of forgiveness, what makes me so different?
And also, that idea just doesn't seem too tough to get in touch with, because if you really can let someone else's mistake go versus holding on to it and never letting them forget it. It's the whole jailer idea. As long as they're in jail with their sins, then you're in jail too, because you got to watch over them and keep them in jail. But if you can just let it go, then there is something that feels good about that. We get in
Sure.
touch with our goodness when we can forgive. And so why wouldn't this idea that if we can forgive other people, we'll release our own guilt? Like, that doesn't feel so abstract. It feels like
It makes
something we can
sense.
get in touch with. Yeah.
It makes sense. And I
So
wanted to read a quote. Just I know we're coming up the end here, but I found this quote online from Patty Duke, of all people. And whereas I can't find the course's wisdom of forgiving others leads to forgiving yourself in formal teachings out there. But here's Patty Duke, and here's what she said. She says, it's toughest to forgive ourselves. So it's probably best to start with other people. It's almost like peeling an onion, layer by layer. Forgiving others, you really do get to the point where you can forgive yourself. I couldn't have said the course's position more perfectly. And here is just somebody's what she's come to through her experience, apparently.
that's amazing that you've been hunting around online trying to find a forgiveness position that mirrors the course, and it comes from Patty Duke.
Yeah, I know.
All right, so we are out of time, but I do think it's worth one, what is the big takeaway here
Mhm.
for this whole thing? So what would you say about what's the big punchline of all of
I
this?
think the big punchline is when it comes to forgiveness, we're in this together. Forgiving them, forgiving ourselves, it all goes together. And we need to realize that, yes, it's hardest to forgive ourselves. And so we need to forgive other people lots and lots and lots so that we finally break down and say, I guess I must have a right to it as well. And while we're forgiving them, we should use as our motivation, this will lead me to let myself off the hook, finally, to have a better sense of who I am, to stand taller, to dump some of this guilt and fear I've been carrying around. Our motivation should be, I'll get to forgive myself through forgiving all of them.
Mm. Yeah, if that podcast episode on our brother as savior is not available, we should definitely record another one, because that idea of we release them and their gratitude or healing comes back on us and releases us. I mean, I feel like what you just said about the big punchline being we're all in this together is so resonant, because yeah, doesn't that just feel right? It feels like the problems of the world are caused by all the ways in which we are separating and continue to separate from each other more and more and more. And here we have, even with forgiveness, it's not just about your peace. It's about seeing what's real and knowing that this is a collective process.
Yeah. And
Love
if you
it.
see what's real in them, you can finally see the divine beauty in yourself.
All right, well, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you, Robert. Thank you to all who are joining us live. If you'd like to attend a live recording of Exploring A Course in Miracles, it's a free service. Go to circleofa.org/events, and we'd love to see you on a future broadcast soon. On behalf of all of us at the Circle of Atonement, thank you so much for watching or listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye for now.